This whole series we've been looking at the Beatitudes, Russ has harped over and over and over again that we're talking about something that is completely countercultural. That when we look at the way Jesus outlines at the start of the Sermon on the Mount, it's a completely different perspective than that the world sees. And a guy by the name of Larry Richards outlines this in a chart that we're just going to have on the screen here, and you can kind of see the difference that plays out as we work through the Beatitudes. But the reality is that this is a completely different perspective than everybody else around. And if we can summarize it down to one simple concept, it's this. The Beatitudes give us a succinct statement of the ethos of the kingdom of heaven that Jesus has announced and summarizes the principles of kingdom life. And it just shapes for us what does it look like to be a part of the kingdom of God. And so we're going to wrap that up this morning, looking at chapter 5, verses 10 to 12. And in that, we talk about this idea of persecution. And so let's just pray quickly, and then we'll kind of jump in to where we want to go. God, this is not always a fun topic to discuss. And something that sometimes we know is a potential or is there, but we just don't really want to touch it necessarily because it's not happy or fun or enjoyable to think on or dwell about. But God, I pray that this morning we would be reminded that this is one of the costs of following you, but that the reward is far greater than anything we could ever experience. And God, I pray that you would help us to center our hearts and our minds on the joy that we have in knowing you, that we would not lose sight of the gift and the promise that comes out of this and get bogged down in the process, but God, that we would see you and your kingdom for what they are. I pray this in your name. Amen. Matthew 5, 10 to 12. Says this, "Be blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Now, just a quick point about this idea of blessed. We've been working through this whole thing, and far too often we see the idea of blessed, or how blessed we are, as being connected to material things or things that we get to receive, or even just the comforts that we enjoy, which is great in our culture and context, but is really difficult when you consider people who are followers of Jesus in places where they don't have those types of material blessings. And so when we look at this, we have to understand that this comes out of the Greek word makarios, which is more than just simply being happy or fortunate, but is rooted in this idea that it's a state of existence in relationship with God in which a person is blessed from God's perspective, even when he or she doesn't feel happy or isn't presently experiencing any good fortune. The blessing we talk about in the Beatitudes is inherently everything to do with God's relationship to us. Nothing to do with what we have or can receive or get on our own. It's completely rooted in God's relationship with us. And so when we talk about this last passage, it's a relatively simple concept. To understand what is persecution isn't necessarily the difficult thing here this morning. There's been other Beatitudes that we've looked at that, what does it mean to be meek, or to be poor in spirit, or to hunger and thirst after righteousness? And those ones take a little bit more unpacking. But if someone says, I'm going to persecute you, we all have a pretty clear sense of that it's not going to be pleasant. And it's not difficult to look at this last little passage and go, okay, blessed are those that are persecuted for Christ's sake, and that their reward is the kingdom of heaven. And so instead of trying to overthink this morning, what I simply want to do is remind us of the truth contained in this little 3 verses that give us hope in the midst of persecution, and that give us a reminder of how incredible Jesus is to us, and that remind us again of the gift that comes in God's gift of heaven. And so a couple things about persecution. First, that many of us are not overly familiar with this firsthand. And it's very easy for us to look around the world and see different contexts and circumstances where this is a daily occurrence and something going on, and for us to go, man, we just do not understand what persecution is like. And so one response to that could be to simply say, well, go spend a year in the Sudan, or go somewhere where you're going to have a rough go for a little while, and then maybe you'll understand. But if we go that route, I think we miss the reality that pain is pain. And just because we're not experiencing persecution in the same context that people might be in other places in the world does not mean that we're immune from it in our own context. When I was in high school and I was going through my own back issues and surgeries and whatever else, I remember laying in a hospital bed in recovery after surgery thinking that I just had the worst life in the world. And as I'm sitting there moping and essentially being miserable by myself and loving it, they wheeled in my roommate for the following week, who was a 12-year-old boy who had just gone through surgery to remove some of the 130-plus tumors that were in his body, and was as happy as could be. And I remember laying there thinking, we're always going to be able to find somebody who has it worse than us. And the same goes for persecution. You talk to people who are deep in the middle of extreme cases of persecution, and they'll be able to look and see somebody else. And Jesus talks about this when he's talking with Peter towards the end of John, and where John's kind of looking at this whole thing, and Jesus has just told him that he's going to die as a result of following him. And Peter kind of looks around and is kind of saying to Jesus, well, what about that guy? What about him? And Jesus' response to him is, hey, that's between me and them. But for me and you, this is what I expect of you. And so we need to be able to find that balance between recognizing that pain is pain and that there is valid experiences of persecution for us, while at the same time recognizing that we're always going to be able to find somebody worse than us. And so there's that tension there between being able to see the hurt of others and not diminish our own, but also not become so focused on our own hurt that we miss what's going on in the rest of the world. In general, this beatitude does not apply to trouble that we bring on ourselves. Some of us, myself often, suffer because of poor decisions that we make. That's not persecution, it's simply cause and effect. If I tell somebody that unless they accept Christ, at that moment I'm going to throw myself into traffic, and they say no, and I jump in front of a bus and break a couple legs, that's on me. That's not persecution. That's not the result of suffering for the cause. That's just plain old stupidity on my part. And I can endure and experience the consequences of that on my own. The other thing is that it's different than simply the brokenness that the world brings. We are in a broken world. And there is suffering and decay and everything that comes with that. And so we talk about persecution. Yes, there is suffering in our lives that God uses to shape and refine and form our character and our identity in Him. But that's not necessarily persecution all the time. That those can be two separate things. Warren Wiersbe is a pastor in the States, and he writes this: if I get in trouble because I talk too much, or because I meddle, or because I try to force my faith on other people, that is not persecution. If I'm promoting my own cause and men reject me, that is not persecution. If I'm arrogant and abusive in my attempt to witness for Christ and people want nothing to do with me, that is not persecution. But if I seek to do His will and honor His name and I suffer, then that is persecution. So it begins to explain a little bit of what we're talking about here. The other thing I want to point out is that it's so significant, this last piece, that Jesus repeats it. The rest of the Beatitudes get one simple statement. This one Jesus comes back to. And the significance here is that this is Matthew who's writing this book. And Matthew, as a Jew, is writing primarily to Jews. And in Jewish literature and in Hebrew culture, if something was significant or needed to be reinforced, they would say it again. There was this idea of repetition would lend a sense of significance to what was being discussed. And so Jesus not only repeats this a second time, but He personalizes it. For the disciples and for the rest of the followers, this goes from third person, blessed is he who is persecuted, to blessed are you. That this becomes a significant thing for the person going through it themselves. And so let's be clear here. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is not a command to go and seek out persecution, which should be a relief. We're not saying go out and tomorrow morning, whether you're at school or at work, find some way that you can get yourself persecuted. Do whatever you got to do. If your neighbor doesn't hate you by the end of the day, you're not doing it right. That's not what we're talking about here. This is not a command to go and find it, but rather it's simply an acknowledgement that as we choose to follow Jesus, it's going to find us. All the way through Scripture, over and over and over, Jesus and then later the Apostle Paul in their writings and in their teachings give us this picture of what it's going to look like when we follow him. Matthew 10:22, John 15:20, John 16:33, Philippians 1:29, 2 Timothy 3:12. You'll see them kind of scroll through on the screen there. And we see this idea that Jesus paints for us that when we follow him, when we serve him, when we choose to give our lives to him, we are going to suffer on account of that. That's something we can take joy in and that we can be excited about because it means that the people are treating us that way because of him. But let's not kid ourselves or get too comfortable. This is bound to happen. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room for interpretation when you look at those passages. That suffering is coming for those who are in Christ. One way to look at it would be this. Jesus' kingdom has arrived. And in the Sermon on the Mount is kind of laying the groundwork and the framework of what his kingdom is going to look like. And in that time, and even today, Jesus' kingdom is arriving and breaking into the culture. And as a result of that, you see this clash of these two different kingdoms, the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of sin. And these two cultures come and meet, and there's all kinds of spectacular confrontation and battle. And we as followers of Christ are going to get in the middle of that clash sometimes. Many of us would be familiar with J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And for some of us, we've read the books and seen the movies. For some of us, we cheated and just watched the movies. But the Lord of the Rings tells this epic journey of Frodo Baggins and his best friend, Samwise Gamgee. And as they go through this whole journey that they've kind of been thrust into, and they go through this whole story and tale of walking across what seems like eternity to destroy this ring and bring hope and restoration. It's this battle of these two kingdoms between the Dark Lord Sauron and the hobbits and everyone else. And there's incredible battles and fights and wars and suffering and hurt on all sides. And at one point in the story, after a particularly fierce battle, Sam begins to reflect on this whole journey and turns to Frodo and he asks this, I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into. In the same way, when we come to Christ, that same question we could ask, I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into. As people who come and are healed and restored at the foot of the cross, we fall into the story of Jesus. And when we do that, we become a part of this clash that's going on, and we become a part of this cosmic battle that's happening. That one day God is going to win and finish once and for all, but in the meantime, there's a war at play spiritually. And we become a part of that. And if we just sit comfortably and securely and feel safe in our context, we miss the fact that just as Sam and Frodo were thrust into, willingly or not, the middle of this ongoing battle, when we come to Christ, we will be persecuted at some point. That we come into this battle and we're thrust into the story of Jesus. The inevitable result of a life lived out in the manner of the Beatitudes is one of persecution. John Piper writes that there are two responses to Jesus, either conversion or rejection. And so as people come into contact with us and discover and see Jesus through the lens of our lives, they're moving towards one of those choices, either conversion or rejection. And Piper suggests that if there's nothing happening at all in our relationships with people, it probably would be for one of two reasons. Either one, we've got our light hidden under a bushel, and people just don't know and they don't see it. And so that brings up a whole separate issue of questions there. And the other conclusion he makes would be that they're just in the process of trying to figure out where they land. And so it's kind of the quiet before the potential storm. That when it comes to Jesus, there's either conversion or rejection. And so if we're intended to be his disciples and his followers and people who choose him and are a part of his kingdom, that will be people's response to us as well. If we're poor in spirit, if we're mournful, if we're meek, if we work our way down through the entire list of Beatitudes, we will be persecuted. Because what Jesus is saying here is this: you'll be persecuted for my sake, because if you live like that, you'll be living my life out in your own. And people never ever liked him. The second portion of that Matthew passage talks about this idea of being persecuted for righteousness. And in the Matthew 10:1, it says, "The blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." But then right away when Jesus repeats it in verse 11, he says, "Persecuted for my sake." And I think it's important that Matthew points out here and that we read this as being the same idea. That we are not persecuted because of our own righteousness, because in and of ourselves we cannot be righteous. When we talk about this idea of being persecuted for righteousness' sake, when we talk a few verses earlier about blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, who hunger and thirst and chase after Jesus. In the same way, blessed are those who are persecuted because of Jesus. True righteousness, the righteousness that surpasses the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, always involves a relationship with Christ. True righteousness is not done for its own sake, but for Jesus' sake. The mercy and the purity and the peacemaking of a disciple of Jesus comes from him. John 15:5, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." And it's done for the honor and glory of Jesus. It's this attachment to Christ that gives the righteousness that we can receive its distinctiveness and its character. Righteousness in Christ is what allows us to come before God, to have relationship with him, but that is only found in Jesus. So don't get sidetracked thinking that we're persecuted because of our own righteousness, or that there's something that we can do on our own to attain this or to achieve this, that it's because of our own doing. No, it is simply because of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 1:30 says this: "It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God." That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Jesus, when we come to him, becomes our righteousness. And it's only through that we can come before God and that we can be restored and forgiven and healed and cleansed. Even after we drop the ball and we continue to fail and to feel like, man, we're getting nowhere in this, it's because of Christ's righteousness that we can come before God. So when it talks about us being persecuted because of righteousness, we're being persecuted because of Jesus. So are we clinging and hanging on to Jesus? Because it's interesting, at the end of that verse 11, it talks about how, as a result of this, we should rejoice and be glad. It's the only beatitude that comes with a command. If you are persecuted because of Jesus, rejoice and be glad, which seems a little bit sadistic. And yet there's all kinds of hope that comes out of that. We can rejoice and be glad because it's a celebration of our identity. If the reason we are persecuted is because of Jesus and because people are reacting to Jesus in our lives, then we can celebrate that persecution, because what it means is that people are identifying us with Christ. We can rejoice because God uses persecution to shape and to refine and to draw us deeper into relationship with him. We can rejoice, just as the passage says, because of the company that we are keeping. You look in the book of Hebrews and the long lists of people who endured all kinds of suffering and hardship for the sake of Christ. And that when we experience persecution, we're in that same list of people and individuals who have suffered because of Christ. That's incredible company to keep. You think through sometimes, even from in sports or athletic endeavors where people become Hall of Famers, and they're always so excited about the company of people that they're there with. And you list all these names of these incredible giants of a sport who get to say, hey, you're one of us now. And there's a bit of hope in that here, that when we persecuted and when we're suffering because of what Christ has done for us and because of our desire to live and serve him, that we are part of that company of people who have given all and risked all for Jesus. And lastly, we can rejoice because of the hope that we have. The promise of Jesus in this beatitude is the kingdom of heaven. Martin Lloyd-Jones, in the early 20th century, was a physician in England who gave up his medical practice to become a pastor. And in the process, took about a 90% pay cut, a significant step down from a social icon status. And somebody asked him once and approached him and said, hey, how do you feel about everything that you've given up? I mean, you gave up all kinds of stuff just so that you could preach. What's with that? And Jones's response was this: I gave up nothing, but I received everything. When we are persecuted because of Jesus, when people see the righteousness of Christ in our lives, we're not giving up anything, but we're receiving everything. And the hope and the promise that comes at the end here is the promise of the kingdom. And if you look at the Beatitudes as a whole, the first one is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And here Jesus comes around, he bookends the whole thing with, blessed are the persecuted, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The start and the end are both the kingdom. That the initial entry into our own awareness of our poverty of spirit and our need for Jesus. And Jesus says, hey, when you come to me, the reward of this is the kingdom. And at the tail end of this, when Jesus says, as a result of everything that you've gone through and as a result of choosing me and following me, the reward is the kingdom. And this bookend of the joy of having the kingdom of heaven. And it's not necessarily a promise of comfort and safety now. Even though as we look at the Lord's Prayer and there's this idea of the now and the not yet, right? Your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And this desire for us to see God's kingdom established and at work in our lives now, but also for the future to come. And we see in this picture of Jesus who looks down the corridor of history until the kingdom will be established in its final form. And he offers this hope when we're in circumstances where it seems doubtful that the kingdom will ever arrive. And it may not look like it from a religious, economic, or social perspective, but the kingdom is ours nonetheless. And we may be experiencing all kinds of hardship or difficulty, or it may feel like, man, we're just slogging through this thing, but the promise is sure. Ours is the kingdom of heaven. Not will be, ours is the kingdom of heaven. That when we choose to be obedient and to serve Jesus and to follow him and to live lives that reflect that kingdom ethos, ours is the kingdom of heaven. I think that the best way to illustrate this morning is to finish with reading a story. And the story is written by Joni Eareckson Tada, who her own life story is fascinating to begin with. And I'd encourage you, if you get a chance, to look at her own story of suffering and difficulty and what God has done in her own life. But she wrote a couple of I don't want to say children's books, but almost allegorical stories way back in the 90s. And my parents bought them from Focus on the Family. And it was one of those things that we did as a family, once a week, where my dad would sit us all down and we'd all kind of, and they'd read this story to us. And wouldn't you know it, these are the stories that have stuck in my head and my heart for years. And I can't find these books anywhere. And so every time I go back to my parents' place, I'll dig them off the shelf and I'll photocopy or I'll handwrite, or I'm trying to get these things all collected because I cannot find them in print anywhere. But there's one particular story that Joni Eareckson Tada writes that's called I Will Always Protect You. And I think it speaks to the promise that Jesus gives us of the kingdom of heaven and what that can look like in the midst of persecution. And it says this: there was once a city of fantastic splendor. Tall buildings, beautiful art, and great riches could be found there. But though its splendor was great, the city was evil. Its rulers acted like criminals, and its citizens lived in fear. Unlike the rulers of the city, the king of the realm to which the city belonged was wise and patient. He granted the city time to change its ways, but year after year the city's sin grew greater. One day the king's patience came to an end. It is time, he said to his court. I will appoint a new ruler for the city, one who will govern as I would. The king turned to his messenger. Go into the countryside. The first man you see working in the fields before the sun has risen is to be brought to me. Bring him through the city as you return." The messenger did as he was commanded. And one cold morning, after several days of riding, and just before sunrise, he saw a man working in a field. And he called out, "Hail, farmer, I have come from the king." "What does my king want?" the farmer answered the approaching messenger. "He has need of you." "And his purpose?" "He will tell you when we arrive. He gives you this letter to carry for your protection," the messenger said as he handed the farmer a letter. The farmer opened it, and it read, "The bearer of this letter is under my protection. Treat him as you would my son. This is my seal, the king." The farmer folded the letter and at once began to walk. "Are you coming with me or not?" he asked the messenger. "I will not keep his majesty waiting." Within a few days, the farmer and the messenger arrived at the west gate of the city. "Take care as we proceed, farmer," the messenger said. "If we keep to ourselves, we will be safe." It was good advice, but not obeyed. For immediately after entering the city, they heard a scream, and the farmer turned to run towards the cry. "Stop," the messenger said, gripping the farmer's arm. "It is not our mission to heed such cries." But the farmer broke free and sharply answered, "Any mission for a kind king could not do otherwise. Let's go." The messenger followed the farmer to an alley where they saw a woman huddled in a corner, and the farmer bent down to comfort her, but was immediately surrounded by 3 hooded figures waving knives. "Welcome to our trap," one of them sneered. "And good show, my lady," he added, speaking to the woman. She stood and joined the attackers. "Let this be a lesson to you," the woman mocked. "Don't meddle in other people's business. Now give us your money." "As you wish," the farmer said, "but you should know that we are under the king's protection. Here is his letter." The thieves broke into loud laughter. "The king? A letter of protection? Be serious, farmer. Your letter means nothing to us." And with that, the woman grabbed the farmer's money and ran away with her partners. The 2 travelers stared after the disappearing thieves. "Will you listen now to my advice?" asked the messenger. "We will see, my friend," answered the farmer. "I make no promises but to obey my king." Making their way to the center of the city, the 2 men soon came upon a horrible sight. In the park, a crowd had gathered around a man and a boy, and the boy knelt on the ground, covering his head with his hands. The man stood above him with a whip, laughing as he brought it down on the boy's bare back. "I already know what you want to do," the messenger whispered to the farmer. "You have a heart to meddle, do you not?" The farmer left the messenger without reply, broke through the crowd, and placed himself between the man and the boy. "Stop! What is the meaning of this cruelty?" "Meaning?" the man asked. "There is no meaning except that this boy is a thief and I am the sheriff, and you are in my way." "But has the boy had a trial?" the farmer asked boldly. "Trial?" the sheriff laughed. "Obviously you're a stranger here." "That is true, sheriff, but the king's justice is not served without a trial." "And who are you to challenge my justice?" the sheriff replied. "A man on a mission for the king." "Then you shall finish your mission in my jail." The sheriff grabbed the farmer and began to drag him away. "But I'm under the king's protection. Here is his letter." And the farmer pulled it from his coat. "This letter is worthless," laughed the sheriff as he read it. "My jail can offer better protection." And the farmer was led away to spend the night in jail. He laid awake until early the next day when the sheriff threw him into the street where the messenger greeted him. "Are you finally ready to continue without stopping for others on the way?" he asked. The farmer shook his head. "Kindness and justice are costly in this city, I grant you, but such a promise cannot be kept. Not while I seek the king." The travelers could see the king's castle in the distance as they left the city through the cast gate, and there they approached 2 men in the road, arguing loudly and waving clubs above their heads. The messenger spoke first. "I'm afraid to ask, farmer, but will you seek peace between these men?" The farmer paused. The attack of the thieves, followed by the night in jail, had tempted him to give up his love for people, and he'd even begun to doubt the king's ability to protect him. But he knew no other course than that which his heart had set. "It is as you fear, messenger. What else can I do?" He led the way and approached the shouting pair. "Stop, men, settle this quarrel now before blood is shed." And he placed a hand on each man's shoulder. "And whose side are you on?" one of them asked angrily. "I am on the side of the king," he replied, "and I seek only what he seeks in this matter, peace. Please lay down your weapons." The pair smiled at each other upon hearing the farmer. "Seems a fool has stumbled into our fight, brother. What say we stop long enough to get rid of him and his slave?" The messenger stepped forward to protest, but the farmer held him back. "The king has given us his protection," he answered, and held out the letter. Evil grins broke across their faces. He has a letter from the king, brother, and it says we should treat him like the king's son. Shall we?" Whereupon the brothers attacked the travelers, beating them cruelly and laughing as they did so. The beating only stopped when the attackers got bored and left the pair to die. And it was not until late in the day that a member of the king's court happened upon the injured men and brought them back to the castle. The messenger was near death, and the farmer badly hurt but strong enough to move about. "I must see the king," he moaned. The farmer's wish was granted. And as he was led into the court, he vowed to withhold his anger at the way he was treated on his journey. But upon seeing the king comfortably seated on his throne, the memory of the journey was too much to bear. "I left my peaceful home to obey your command," he accused the king, "and I traveled at great peril. I've been robbed, jailed, and beaten. The citizens of the city of your kingdom are monsters. And worse still, your letter of protection meant nothing. Why? Why?" The room was silent for several moments as the king gazed at the injured farmer. "Welcome," he said at last, seeming to ignore the man's anger. "I've been waiting for you. You are, as I thought, the man that I need." "For what, your majesty?" the farmer stuttered, confused by the king's greeting. "To rule the city, of course. You are a man of kindness and justice and peace. This is what the city needs in a ruler. Do you not agree?" "Yes, but..." The farmer paused in disbelief, still hurt and confused by all that had happened. "Your letter. Why was I not protected?" "Come," the king commanded, "and I will show you." He led the farmer to a mirror beside the throne. "Do you see our images there?" he asked. "Yes." "And what do you see?" The farmer laughed softly. "I see a poor farmer clothed in rags, with cuts and bruises, standing next to a king in royal robes." "True, farmer. But look again. This time look into your eyes, and there you will see what was protected. For it was not your body that needed protection, but rather your heart, because you have been chosen to be my heir. My subjects' evil actions towards you, born of their hatred for me, have refined and shaped you as a man. And it had to be so, for you were meant to reign in my image." The farmer gazed intently into the mirror, and as he did so, his ragged clothes and his wounds and his bruised body faded from view. And what he saw was the man he had become, a man whose character could stand against the fires of evil. He had known the king's protection after all. He knelt on grateful knees before the king. "Come, my son," the king said as he laid his hand on the farmer's head. "Your reign as prince has begun." The Beatitudes are not the be-all and end-all in and of themselves. They're not a magic pill. They're not some secret code we're to follow. And they aren't even a means of entering or advancing the kingdom in and of themselves. But they're an expression of a spirit-produced kingdom life, revealing to the entire world that the transformation of creation starts with the transformation of the heart of the disciples. God's promise of the kingdom does not promise safety and security, but it promises us Him.